Emma Williams, 28-year-old housekeeper, was cleaning her employer's study when she found something that made her blood run cold. A gold necklace with a heart-shaped pendant hidden behind a bookshelf. This wasn't just any necklace. She recognized this piece immediately because she'd seen it in every family photograph. It belonged to Catherine Blackwood, the wife of James, who died 3 years earlier in a car accident. When Emma knocked on the study door to return it, she didn't expect the coldest and most distant man in London to break down in tears before her eyes. What he confessed to her in that moment changed both their lives forever. Thornfield Manor stood majestically in the Surrey countryside, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that looked like they belonged in Country Life magazine. Every room exuded quiet luxury. Carrara marble, 18th-century frescoes, period furniture worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Emma Williams walked these golden corridors every morning for 2 years, carrying only a bucket, some cloths, and the silent dignity of those who know they're invisible. At 28, she'd learned to move like a ghost through these opulent spaces, cleaning, tidying, organizing the life of a man who never looked her in the eye when giving instructions. James Blackwood was heir to an industrial empire worth $600 million. But for 3 years he'd lived like a hermit in his manor, tall, distinguished, with black hair beginning to gray at the temples and blue eyes that once must have sparkled with life. He now seemed a shadow of himself. He always wore perfect suits, but it was as if he dressed for a role he no longer wanted to play. Emma observed him secretly while he worked in his study, always on the phone with solicitors, managers, brokers. He spoke of millions with the same indifference others spoke of the weather. But in his movements, in the way he'd pause to stare at certain photographs on his desk, she saw something others missed, a pain so deep it seemed to have hollowed him from within. That October morning, as golden autumn light filtered through the study's tall windows, Emma was dusting the bookshelf that occupied an entire wall. James had gone to one of his rare meetings in the city, and Emma could finally work without feeling the weight of his judgmental silence. It was while moving a particularly heavy volume of art history that she saw it, a small golden glint hidden in the gap between bookshelf and wall. Emma reached out and felt her fingers touch something cold and precious. She carefully withdrew what proved to be an 18-karat gold necklace with a heart-shaped pendant set with tiny diamonds. Her heart stopped when she recognized this piece. She'd seen it hundreds of times in the photographs scattered throughout the manor, around the neck of Catherine Blackwood, James's wife, who'd died 3 years earlier in a tragic car accident. In every photo, Catherine smiled, radiant and in love. With this necklace gleaming against her fair skin, Emma stood paralyzed for several seconds, contemplating this small treasure that contained an entire broken love story. How had it ended up here? How long had it been hidden in this narrow space? And most importantly, did James know it was missing? The necklace was warm to the touch, as if it still held the warmth of its wearer. Emma turned it in her fingers, noticing the engraving on the back of the pendant. "Forever yours, Jay." A love message that now seemed like a promise broken by fate. She heard the sound of James's Bentley coming up the drive. He'd returned earlier than expected. Emma quickly hid the necklace in her apron pocket, her heart pounding. She had to return it, obviously, but something told her this moment would mark a point of no return. James entered the study with his usual determined stride, throwing his jacket onto a chair without even looking at her. He sat at his desk and began leafing through some documents, his brow furrowed in that perpetually worried expression Emma had learned to recognize. He asked if she'd finished here without looking up, as always. Emma took a deep breath and said she'd found something she believed belonged to him. For the first time in 2 years, James raised his eyes and looked at her directly. There was something different in her tone that had caught his attention. Emma carefully pulled the necklace from her pocket, holding it between her hands as if it were made of glass. She explained it had fallen behind the bookshelf, The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at the necklace, as if seeing a ghost, his face paling to paper white. His hands began to tremble, and Emma saw something she'd never seen before in this controlled and distant man's eyes. Tears. He whispered Catherine's name, his voice breaking. And then, before Emma's incredulous eyes, the most powerful and feared man in London collapsed. He covered his face with his hands and began to cry like a child, sobs shaking his normally rigid shoulders. Emma remained motionless, not knowing what to do. She'd never seen a grown man cry so desperately. Certainly not her employer, who'd barely spoken to her. Through his tears, James managed to say he'd been searching for this necklace for 3 years. He thought he'd lost it forever. It was the last thing he had left of Catherine. In that moment, Emma understood she'd just returned much more than a simple necklace. She'd returned a piece of this man's broken heart. James remained seated at his desk for long minutes, the necklace clutched in his fist, as if he feared it might vanish again. Emma hadn't moved from her position, trapped between wanting to leave to respect his private grief and being unable to abandon him in this state. Slowly, James managed to compose himself. He dried his eyes, straightened his tie, but something in his face had changed. It was as if a mask had fallen, revealing the real man hidden behind the iron facade of the industrial magnate. He apologized, saying she shouldn't have seen him like that. Emma replied that she'd only returned what belonged to him. James opened his fist and looked at the necklace again. The evening light made the small diamonds sparkle like stars. He began telling her he'd given it to Catherine on their first anniversary. She'd said she didn't want expensive jewelry, preferred flowers, but he wanted to show her their love was precious, that it would last forever. Emma remained silent, instinctively understanding that James needed to talk for the first time in 3 years. James continued with a broken voice, speaking of that night. They'd argued over something silly he couldn't even remember. Catherine had left angry, and he was too proud to stop her. If he'd run after her, if he'd stopped her, the police said it was an accident. Wet road, sudden braking. But he knew the truth. If they hadn't argued, Catherine would still be there. Emma felt the need to offer comfort. She gently told him accidents happen, that he couldn't blame himself for something he couldn't control. James looked at her properly for the first time, as if really seeing her. His blue eyes were still moist, but there was gratitude in them. He continued, explaining that after Catherine's death, this necklace had disappeared. He'd searched everywhere, had half the house dismantled. It was the only tangible thing he had left of her, and losing it had been like losing her a second time. For the first time, James asked Emma a personal question. How long had she worked there? When she answered 2 years, he shook his head, realizing he'd never even asked her name. Emma introduced herself. James repeated her name as if savoring it, then asked about her family, what she did besides work. Emma confessed she studied English literature in the evenings, working during the day to finance her studies and send money home to her parents in Yorkshire. James looked at her with an indecipherable expression, wondering what kind of man he'd become, not to know even these basic things about the person living in his house. The sun was setting, tinting the study gold. James stood and approached the window, still holding the necklace. He said he didn't know how to thank her for what she'd done. Emma replied she'd only done what was right. James turned to her, and in his eyes was something Emma had never seen. Human warmth. He told her she'd done much more. She'd returned a piece of his soul. As their gazes met in the golden evening light, Emma felt something changing between them. Their story had just begun. In the days following the necklace's discovery, the atmosphere at Thornfield Manor changed radically. James began greeting Emma, asked how her studies were going, inquired if she needed anything. It was as if that evening had opened a door closed for too long. Emma noticed James always carried Catherine's necklace with him, touching it through his shirt like a talisman. But instead of seeming sadder, paradoxically he appeared more serene. as if finding this piece of the past had allowed him to look toward the future again. One November morning, James appeared in the kitchen, a place he'd never entered before. He asked if he could sit and offered to help with her university studies. He had a degree in literature and could help with her dissertation, lend her books. When Emma asked why, James replied that she'd returned something precious to him, and because Catherine would have wanted him to help someone with their dreams. From that day began an unexpected routine. After cleaning, they'd sit in James's study talking about Shakespeare, Dickens, literature. James proved a passionate teacher, able to bring these texts alive with surprising modernity. James told her how he'd fallen in love with Catherine in a bookshop, how she'd convinced him to plant roses at the manor. Emma spoke of Yorkshire, the moors she missed, the parents she hadn't seen for 2 years. One December evening, while it snowed, James brought out the necklace and told her the complete story. Catherine worked in a bookshop. He went every week with the excuse of buying books. Catherine taught him about love through novels, until he found courage to ask her to dinner. On their wedding day, Catherine had made him promise never to stop learning and growing. Love was like a book. If you stop turning pages, the story ends. James confessed that, after Catherine's death, he'd stopped turning pages. But Emma had reminded him the story wasn't finished, only changed. Their gazes met in the soft light. James tenderly said Emma was changing his life. In that moment, as snow fell and the necklace gleamed between them, Emma understood her life was about to change forever too. Christmas Eve at Thornfield Manor had always been lonely for James. These past 3 years, he'd avoided celebrations, shutting himself in his study with whiskey and memories of Catherine decorating the tree while singing. But this Christmas Eve was different. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He'd asked Emma to stay beyond her usual hours.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Not to work, but because he didn't want to spend this evening alone. They sat in the drawing room before the fireplace. James had opened a vintage port from 1985, saved for a special occasion that had never come. Emma wore a navy dress James had never seen her in, her hair loose instead of the usual work chignon. James asked her to tell him about Christmas in Yorkshire. Emma told of Christmas Eve with traditional puddings, her father who worked as a mechanic returning with hands that smelled of oil, his sayings about Christmas being about togetherness, not gifts. James observed she must miss home. Emma confessed yes, but these had been the most beautiful months since she'd been in London. James had made her feel less alone. Suddenly, James said he had to tell her something. He ran his hand through his hair, nervous. He knew it was wrong, but he was falling in love with her. Emma felt her heart race. She'd dreamed of these words, but now didn't know what to answer. James continued quickly. He knew it was complicated. There were differences. People would talk. But these past months, she'd made him live again, reminded him what it meant to smile and hope. Emma stood and walked to the window. She confessed she too felt something for him, but feared being just a way to forget Catherine. James reached her, taking her face in his hands. Catherine would always be in his heart, but what he felt for Emma was different. He didn't want to forget Catherine. He wanted to honor what she'd taught him about love. True love doesn't end. It transforms. Emma was the new home for that love. Emma looked into James's eyes and saw complete sincerity. She confessed she too was falling in love with him. James kissed her tenderly. Then he took out Catherine's necklace, speaking to the pendant to thank his wife and ask her to bless this new love. He kissed the pendant and placed the necklace in the box on the mantelpiece. Emma asked if he wouldn't wear it anymore. James said no. Its place was there, to protect this house and this new love. As midnight bells announced Christmas, they kissed, knowing they were beginning a new life together. News of the relationship between James Blackwood and his housekeeper exploded in London papers like a bomb. Headlines were cruel. The Tycoon and Cinderella. Love across class lines. From duster to millionaire's heart. Emma woke one January morning to find photographers stationed outside the gates. Her photo was everywhere. Stolen shots of her leaving the manor, shopping, going to university. She felt like a caged animal. That evening, she showed James the latest article describing her as a cunning Yorkshire lass who captured the broken heart of London's richest widower. James clenched his fists, promising lawsuits, but Emma stopped him. This was exactly what they expected, for him to use his power to protect her, confirming their theories. The real storm came from family. Mother Margaret and Sister Charlotte appeared unannounced. Emma heard their sharp voices from the drawing room. Disgrace to the family. That girl who took advantage. Catherine's turning in her grave. When James called Emma in, she found two immaculately dressed women looking at her with contempt. Margaret, in her Chanel suit, coldly asked how much she'd demanded from her son to be with him. Emma kept her voice calm, replying she'd never asked for anything, and never would. When Margaret laughed sarcastically about love between a housekeeper and an heir, Emma proudly replied that love knows no class boundaries. Margaret left, threatening James to remember his responsibilities to family and company. He couldn't ruin centuries of reputation for a whim. Pressures continued. Business partners questioned James's mental stability. Important clients threatened to withdraw. Emma's university received pressure to remove her. One evening, Emma found James with his head in his hands. On the table were resignation letters from 3 executives and articles with private details only someone close could know. Someone in the family was talking to the papers. Emma, tired, said maybe they should stop. Looking at the chaos around, family hating him, partners abandoning him, papers persecuting them, she asked if it was worth it for a story, perhaps doomed to fail. James stood and reached her. He reminded her of Catherine's words. True love is recognized by the difficulties one's willing to face to protect it. If this was true love, it was worth any battle. Emma looked at him, seeing the same determination as that night with the necklace. She said he was right. It was worth any battle. They kissed with the promise to face everything together. Outside, photographers waited, but inside Thornfield Manor, 2 people in love had decided never to give up. A year later, Thornfield Manor glowed in the May sunshine. The gardens were in full bloom. Catherine's roses had blossomed in all their glory, creating a carpet of colors and scents that seemed to bless what was about to happen. Emma looked at herself in the master bedroom mirror, still incredulous to find herself there. She wore a simple but elegant wedding dress, specially designed by a London stylist. No pearls, no diamonds, only Catherine's necklace that James had asked her to wear that day. He'd told her Catherine would have wanted it, that she loved happy endings. The past year had been difficult, but transformative. Emma had completed her studies with top honors, specializing in contemporary literature, with a dissertation on social relationships in the novels of Jane Austen. Work James had helped her perfect, and which was praised by the entire examining board. Gradually, even James's family had begun accepting Emma. The turning point came when Margaret Blackwood had a mild heart attack, and Emma spent 3 days and nights at hospital caring for her, ignoring venomous comments and tending her with the same devotion she'd have shown her own mother. One evening, Margaret had squeezed her hand, whispering that perhaps she'd been wrong about her. Perhaps she was exactly what James needed. The business world, too, had eventually respected James's choice. Emma had proven herself an intelligent and discreet partner, able to attend gala dinners without ever losing her authenticity, to converse with industrialists and politicians while maintaining the simplicity that made her special. But above all, everyone could see how much James had changed. He'd become again the brilliant and visionary man he'd been before, but with a wisdom and depth he'd never had. Emma had made him better, and that was undeniable. The ceremony took place in the Rose Garden, before 50 carefully chosen guests. Emma's family from Yorkshire, with eyes full of pride and disbelief. some true friends of James, colleagues who'd learned to value Emma, and even some journalists who'd followed their story from the beginning. When James saw Emma walking toward the altar accompanied by her father, a simple and dignified man wearing his only good suit, his eyes moistened. She was beautiful, but above all, she radiated a happiness that made the entire garden brighter. The vicar celebrating the wedding had known them during preparation months and understood he wasn't just uniting two people, but two souls who'd found each other at the right moment to heal together. During the exchange of vows, Emma told James he'd taught her that true love isn't possession, but freedom. It's not forgetting the past, but building a better future on those foundations. She promised to love him every day, support his dreams, and grow with him. James replied with emotion that Emma had taken a broken man and taught him to live again. She'd honored Catherine's memory by loving him with the same purity Catherine had loved him. He promised to protect her, respect her, and love her with everything he was. When they kissed to seal their union, all guests stood applauding. But what no one expected was what happened next. James took Emma's hand and led her to the house, stopping before Catherine's portrait hanging in the main hall. Together, they placed a bouquet of white roses at the painting's base. James whispered his thanks to the portrait. Thank you for teaching him what love was. Emma felt deep peace fill her heart. She wasn't replacing Catherine. She was continuing the love story Catherine had begun, in a different but equally true form. During the celebration, as guests danced in the illuminated gardens and the sun set painting everything gold and rose, Emma and James found themselves alone on the terrace, where they'd declared their love. James asked if she was happy. Emma replied she hadn't even known one could be so happy, using the same words he'd said to her months before. James smiled, telling her what her father had said that day, that in Yorkshire there was a saying, "He who finds treasure and doesn't know it is a poor wretch." He'd said James was fortunate because he'd recognized the treasure when he found it. Emma laughed, eyes shining with tears of joy. She, too, had found her treasure. As they danced slowly under the stars, with music drifting softly from the garden and the scent of roses filling the air, James and Emma knew they'd won the most important battle. Against prejudice, against class differences, against those who believed true love couldn't exist between two such different worlds. Catherine's necklace, now around Emma's neck, gleamed in the moonlight like a blessing. It wasn't a symbol of replacement, but of continuity, love that never dies, but transforms and finds new ways to manifest itself. And as Thornfield Manor resonated with laughter and music for the first time in 4 years, everyone knew this wasn't just the end of one story, but the beginning of a new love legend that would be told for generations. Love had triumphed, as always, as it should be. If this story has moved you, if you've believed in the power of love that overcomes every social barrier, then you must share it. Because every day, simple and genuine people perform acts of honesty that change lives. Housekeepers who return valuable objects instead of stealing them. Powerful men who choose true love over social conventions. Brave women who fight for their feelings against all odds. Like, if you believe true love can overcome any obstacle. Comment, have you ever made an honest gesture that changed everything? Share with those who need to believe in love beyond appearances. Sometimes a small act of honesty can open the doors of the most closed heart. And true love knows no boundaries of class or money.